Palestinian society, there's the ongoing debate, and again, this is something that is always underreported in Western media. There's an ongoing debate within Palestinians whether or not armed resistance, as they see it, is the right approach in their self-determination. There are those who subscribe to the notion that you can't be part of a peace process while settlements continue to expand, while your rights are continuing being deprived. And there are those who argue that the only way through this injustice is through armed resistance, such as firing rockets, such as carrying out whatever attacks they see as fit. That debate takes place within Palestinian society, and by no means is it absent from there. And I think in order to really delve into what is the backstory behind this war, you really have to look at the timeline of the past few decades and what Israel's trying to achieve in terms of its security, what the Palestinians are trying to achieve in terms of their liberation, in terms of their self-determination.
Could you tell us a little of your history? How did you hook up? Where are you from? How did you hook up with them?
Sure.
How did you get, whatever it is that brought you to where you are now?
Sure. I kind of stumbled into journalism, to be honest with you. I never intended to go into journalism. In fact, it was during 2000, the Camp David talks between Yasser Arafat and Mubarak. I was in Washington, D.C. at a barbecue, and 4th of July, was just I was a grad student at the time, and so I was speaking to someone who I started just kind of mouthing off to about American media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it turned out to be that he was a producer at NBC News. So he asked me if I would be interested in pursuing a journalism career, and so I gave him my resume, and 6 months later, my very first day of working in news was President Bush's inauguration. So I had no idea what I was doing. They gave me a phone and told me to go down and just cover. I mean, they had like a huge operation, so it wasn't like I was in an integral part, but they were just like, go out, and if you see anything, let us know what was happening. And I was really excited. I was walking around with my little press badge, and 9 months later, September 11th happened, and I was the only Arab-speaking producer, so to speak, intern who was working for NBC News in the Washington bureau. So I suddenly found myself in like a little room with a stack of Osama bin Laden tapes, and they were asking me like, can you translate this? And people were asking me like, what's the significance of September 11th? Does he say anything about it? And a lot of the tapes that he had said, which I was familiar with, just having watched Al Jazeera Arabic and watched a lot of news organizations reporting about bin Laden over the years, was that this was a guy who was dead set about going to war with America. So it's not like he was saying something new in any of these tapes or statements. But here I was suddenly asked to translate it, and really what that gave me was an opportunity that was very unprecedented, because I was at a very young age. Suddenly I found myself in the middle of the biggest story of my life, and the biggest story for so many people. And I was getting access to experience that I never would have otherwise had. After that, 1 year after the September 11th attacks, and throughout the course of that year, I ended up going to cover Operation Enduring Freedom. And then there was the talk about the U.S. starting to possibly do something with Iraq. President Bush gave a speech at the end of the following year. And at that point, I really knew that I had grown interested in the role that I was playing as an Arab American journalist. I felt that there was a very important role for people who had one foot in both worlds to play. My personal background is that I was born in Egypt. My father's Egyptian, my mother's Palestinian. I had lived a large portion of my life in the Middle East, the vast majority of it, though, in the United States. So I always felt myself as an ambassador of both worlds. When I lived in the Middle East, I was always explaining to my Arab friends and others the reality of what American society was, American culture was, American people. And when I lived in the United States, I was always trying to explain who Arabs were, what Arabs were, how Muslims lived, and the kind of complexities that exist in the Arab world. So it was certainly something that I grew very fond of and wanted to pursue it. So I left NBC News to go work for CNN. And I ended up going to cover the Iraq War for CNN as a producer. And I went there and I ended up staying in Baghdad for about 2.5 years. I covered the immediate aftermath of the war and the reconstruction efforts and the turmoil in that. And at that time I met the Al Jazeera Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Al Jazeera Arabic. And he asked me would I be interested in working for Al Jazeera English. And at the time I said, I didn't think it was going to happen. I didn't think they were going to be able to pull it off. And they were very determined, and in fact, 2 years later, I left CNN to go work for Jazeera as a correspondent. I started working in DC first, and then I moved to Doha, and then I left Doha and I went to work in Gaza. I became the Gaza correspondent there. We had a correspondent when the network launched. She moved to the West Bank, and then I moved to Gaza. So that's how I ended up here.
Thank you.
Good questions. Yes, ma'am?
First, when you spoke earlier about the short attention spans of U.S. and Western media, I thought of the poem by the late African-American poet June Jordan, that she has a poem titled Nightline, September 21st, 1982, and it's a quote from that news program, and the quote is, "I know it's an unfortunate way to say it, but can you put the massacre on the back burner now?" And that quote, it's about Sabra and Shatila, and every time I think about that, it just gives me chills, because of course it's exactly something that can't be backburnered, and it's exactly how, and I think the U.S. media today would not even cover, and doesn't give any amount of attention. But what I wonder is, well, I can get my head around what the politics are of the U.S. Not having reporters in Gaza and covering it only in the most limited and distorted ways. What I'm wondering is, what's your sense of the politics of the European news coverage of the region, and what shapes their limited attention spans and distortions?
I think European coverage is slightly a little bit ahead of American media in terms of its interest in the Arab world, and I think that's probably because of the interaction and the proximity Europe has with the Arab world. America was never historically seen as a colonial power. It never divided any of the countries in the Arab world. I mean, it's always had a presence there, but it was never seen as a true colonial power in the sense that France was, in the sense that Britain was. And I think over generations, over decades, the proximity that Europe had with the Middle East always gave Europeans an interest in affairs that were there, and many of the conflicts that exist today in the Middle East are a direct result of those policies. So in some ways, many European journalists continue to cover it from that perspective, whereas American media never had the perspective. I think nowadays they're starting to see how things that affect the things that are happening in the Middle East directly shape American policy and vice versa. But I don't think that, just a decade ago, that statement would have been as true in terms of viewership, not in terms of government policy. I think the government has always, realized the connection. But I don't think most Americans know what's the connection between their government's policies and how it will affect them. And that's really the role of the media in this case, because we want the media to explain to us what is it that our government does in the Middle East and how does that impact us? How does that impact us from really the most basic, parts of our day-to-day life, the price of fuel, the goods that we eat, the stability of the region, and American attitudes towards Americans. I mean, having lived so much in the Arab world, I can tell you that one of the biggest misconceptions I constantly hear is that Arabs and Muslims hate the American way of life, and that's why they're constantly, the Muslim world. And I hate that term. I hate the Muslim world, because I've never heard anyone say the Christian world or the Jewish world. And it's as if like the Muslim world is like some big monolithic entity that just speaks with one voice. But nonetheless, they see the Muslim world as hating the American way of life. And in reality, I don't think that's true. I personally believe that if there's anything that the Arab world wants, is the freedom that exists in America, which is the core of the American way of life. The individual liberties and the rights that people here are guaranteed. And they're being deprived of those. So it's counterintuitive to say that Arabs or Muslims hate the American way of life, and that's why this kind of East-West conflict is always portrayed the way it is in Western media. Europeans are slightly more advanced in their interaction with the Arab world than the Muslim world, and therefore their coverage is slightly more nuanced. There's an interest in really how, and plus also their populations, their demographics tend to have more of an interest in that. There's sizable Muslim populations in France and Europe, and sizable Arab populations as well across Europe. So they have a genuine interest in that, and I think that also shapes a little bit of the media coverage. But by no means are any of these major organizations in Europe and in the US tackling the head-on root questions of this conflict. We still kind of deal with these issues on the periphery, and we tend to neglect, or they tend to neglect, the roots of this conflict. People nowadays are talking about issues like security, settlements, Jerusalem, and these are core issues, there's no doubt about it.